I think I will get started. We're a little bit past the time. So let me get started. I'm very pleased to welcome here today a longtime friend and colleague of mine, Tom Simons, a former senior U.S. State Department official in the 1980s who dealt with Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. He recounted his experience during that time in dealing with the Soviet Union in an article that was published a couple of months ago in this journal called Reykjavik Up Close, Reagan and Gorbachev, October 1986 and after. And so he won't be dealing with that topic so much today. I'll be focusing much more on East Central Europe. And you can find a copy of this article online too with the seminar announcement.
It's very good.
So, so I'll pass this around in case anyone wants to take a look at it. But that deals with U.S.-Soviet relations during the early Reagan period, but then particularly focusing on the summit at Reykjavik in 1986, where the two leaders, Reagan and Gorbachev, came close to a major deal and it then fell through, as is recounted in the article. It did have a major impact, nonetheless, despite that failure on U.S.-Soviet relations. But and Tom discusses that as well in the article. He is currently has long been a senior fellow at the Davis Center. And prior to that, in addition to his work at the State Department, had been U.S. ambassador to Poland during the very early post-communist period, and then was ambassador to Pakistan in the mid-1990s. He has been at Harvard, it's his alma mater, and it is also for both undergraduate and PhD. And he
No.
It wasn't
Yale undergraduate.
Yale. Okay, Yale undergraduate.
Ecumenical.
And history PhD here at Harvard. And he has written numerous books, including a memoir that I hope will be coming out soon in full. Parts of it have already appeared, but the memoir, which I have seen, is really a wonderful survey of both his own career, but also of some of the episodes of U.S. foreign policy that he witnessed and took part in. So Tom will speak first for about 35 to 40 minutes, and then we will have commentary by Nadia Boyadjieva, a professor of international relations and international law at the Balkan Studies Institute in Sofia, Bulgaria, and also at Plovdiv University in Bulgaria. She's a joint professor there and is also a long-term visiting scholar at the Davis Center and a associate, again, a long-term associate of the Davis Center. So we will have her commentary after Tom's done. Please, Tom.
Okay, well, thank you all for coming. Nadia, thanks for being the commentator, and Mark, thanks for being the moderator and sort of the inspiration. As Mark said, our original thought was to do U.S. policy toward both the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, but since the article came out, and also that would have been a very heavy load, we decided to really concentrate here on policy toward Eastern Europe. And my 1980s meant Ronald Reagan's 2 terms as president and George H.W. Bush's first year, 1989. Between 1981 and 1985, I was director for Soviet Affairs in the State Department's Bureau of European and Canadian Affairs. And then after a year of training from mid-1986 to mid-1989, I was the Deputy Assistant Secretary in that bureau, responsible for relations with the Soviet Union, Eastern Europe, and Yugoslavia. We sort of separated Yugoslavia out for special treatment. My remit for Eastern Europe did not include the GDR, which was combined with Germany or Albania, with which we had no relations at all. But Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania and Bulgaria were enough to keep busy with. Poland was great. Poland was the most engaging and the most consequential for the U.S. Its regime wrestled with legal solidarity, the trade union combining working class and intelligentsia, until the regime declared martial law in December of 1981. And then the wrestling continued with underground solidarity, which kept itself alive, although weakened, until a power sharing agreement was negotiated in April of 1989, which provided for semi-free elections in June of that year. June 4th is a date that Poles remember because it was a crashing defeat for the communists, and it sort of ended their hope of competing for political power in any serious way. Now, in the other East European countries, it was a decade of decay, in increasingly fretful stability, I would call it that, which ended in breakdown toward the end of 1989, the fall of the Berlin Wall on November 9th, and between then and Ceausescu's execution in Romania on Christmas Day. So those were my 1980s. I'd like to welcome two former colleagues in the State Department, officers like me. At the desk, George Kroll, who after a tremendous career ended up as ambassador to Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, or I think in reverse order, Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan.
Or that Belarus.
And Belarus.
Remember that?
That's right, yeah. Proud to serve. And who is now teaching at the Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island. And on the back row, Andrew Goodman, 2 tours in the Soviet Union, and on the desk in Washington, and is now a freelance writer in Saratoga, New York. Both of them knew Putin during their tours in Leningrad and St. Petersburg. And I hope if they will drive to hear me talk, that one day they will drive to talk themselves about their experience with Putin. I think it'd be an interesting session in its own right. Now, policy toward the Soviet Union was always primary in terms of department attention and energy. And that's described in the article that Mark published and that went around. So this will just be, this will mainly be Eastern Europe, but I wanted to talk about the setting, which was framed by Soviet policy. The Reagan administration came in 1981 really with the bit between its teeth when it came to the Soviet Union. It considered the Soviet Union a rising power, as Kissinger had, the Nixon-Kissinger administration before Carter. It had campaigned against Nixon-Kissinger détente, and it was determined to mobilize American resources and alliances against the Soviet Union. But both the US and the Soviet Union were actually on the defensive. I mean, they were in kind of a defensive crouches in that period. The US had lost a lot of confidence in Vietnam and with Watergate. When I taught at Stanford, I remember telling my students that I hoped they would never live in an America that demoralized. Again, and of course, here we are in 2024. But the main thing was that neither of them were picking fights. And within the administration, there was a broad agreement that our first priorities ought to be domestic economic recovery and rearmament, so very substantial rearmament, and restoring leadership in our alliances, which Carter among other things, let slip toward the end. Carter called a meeting in NATO, and nobody came. So, well, people refused to come. I mean, it wasn't that he got there and there was no one there. People just wouldn't gather around. But maintaining, restoring alliances meant really keeping much of the framework that was inherited from the 1970s, the arms control agreements, a whole raft of agreements, sectoral agreements for space and technological thing, fishing, that were out there and that were going to provide a structure to the relationship. And it meant keeping the negotiations that were underway with regard both to strategic weapons, the SALT negotiations, which they changed to START. In other words, not strategic arms limitation, but strategic arms reduction, to show that they were different and more ambitious. And the negotiations on long-range, intermediate-range nuclear forces, the medium-range forces that the Soviets had deployed in the 1970s, and that targeted Europe only. So there's a great fear that our protection of Europe, extended deterrence, would no longer count if they attack, that we would not sacrifice ourselves if they were to attack Europe without attacking us. So NATO in 1979 had come to a decision to pursue negotiations with the Soviets, but for a limited time period. And if they were unsuccessful, by 1983, we would deploy our own INF, as it was called. And so the Reagan administration kept those going, although it had actually very little appetite for negotiations at the beginning. It was really in it because our public and our allies valued the achievements of the 1970s. But under that kind of pressure, it came up with two bold proposals. In November 1981, the president proposed a zero option for INF, in other words, eliminating INF on both sides, which meant on the Soviet side, because we hadn't deployed yet. And in March of 1982, you said June. In June of 1982, he proposed very, very deep reductions in strategic offensive weapons, the intercontinental ballistic missiles, to equal levels, which of course required the Soviets, because they had more of them, to eliminate many more than we would have to. On their face, both of those proposals were non-negotiable. I mean, the Soviets really weren't expected to climb on board right away. And they were typical treaties of the Potomac between those who really didn't like negotiations because they knew that these were going to go nowhere for a while. And on the other hand, people like me who were pleased to keep the structure of relations going for better days. Now, that was the context, the Soviet context for our approach to Eastern Europe. And the slow crisis in the Soviet Union's East European Empire actually came to a head at about the same time. We're talking 1981. And it came to a head in Poland. The Polish regime was wearing down in the 1970s. It was reaching the limits of what you could accomplish with Stalinist economic development. And it was taking on huge hard currency debt, which went from 700 million in 1971 to 23 billion in 1980, in the hope that it could import machinery that would increase productivity enough to pay off the debt. And that was not working. And so you had a downhill slide in the economy. And meanwhile, Polish intellectuals and workers who had been kept apart in the two previous crises, politically of 1968 and 1970 came together in a new trade union organization called Solidarity. It had a new ethos. It was not interested in taking power. It was interested in what I would call really moral reform and the emphasis was on rights rather than power. And the Polish church, which was a conservative church, sponsored the Solidarity movement. To do so, it had to spread its mission out from protecting just believers to protecting all citizens. But that church sponsorship made Solidarity a mass movement. And as the economic situation deteriorated in 1979, you had almost nationwide strikes breaking out under Solidarity leadership. And the regime chose to negotiate with Solidarity. And the result was 18 months of political contest between a regime losing confidence and a Solidarity gaining in confidence with every passing month. In 1980, the Carter administration, the outgoing Carter administration, had warned the Soviets against intervention in Poland. But in the fall of 1981, Solidarity grew more and more radical, radicalized. Things were happening like calling for the end of the Warsaw Pact and really crossing all sorts of regime red lines. But the Reagan administration, still in its first year, basically looked on as martial law was declared. In other words, the Soviets, it was not the Soviets who intervened, but the Polish army that took over and delegalized Solidarity on December 13th, 1981. Now, NATO's response really to the Polish martial law really set Western policy toward Eastern Europe for the next decade. It was tinkered out in a special meeting of the NATO Council in Brussels in January of 1982. And it was a compromise between the US, which wanted sanctions on both Poland and the Soviet Union without any conditionality. In other words, without any possibility of reversal, without further steps. And the European allies, who were afraid of losing the achievements in European East-West relations of the détente period. And so what was decided and registered in a special declaration that month was there would be sanctions on both countries, but they would be conditional. In other words, they were reversible if Poland would take 3 steps in the future. First, the end of martial law. Second, the release of political prisoners, because about 10,000 people were arrested in jail that December. Solidarity was a huge organization. I mean, it had 10 million people, and about a third of Communist Party members were also Solidarity members. So it was a national organization. And so the second criterion was the release of political prisoners. And the third was dialogue with Solidarity and the church. So that was NATO policy from there on. I was in Brussels as an observer. I should also say that even the weather was dramatic because the lightning storms racked Brussels while we were there. And my plane home was diverted by the Air Florida crash in the Potomac outside Washington. So you really did get the feeling that nature was upset as well as the political system. Now, we tended to lump the East Europeans with the Soviets. I mean, just an old habit, as we did in the case of Polish sanctions. but we usually dealt with each country bilaterally. Their aging leaderships at this point were basically holding on. They were hoping that once the Polish crisis settled down, that East-West economic ties would bounce up again. And as the years went on, it became apparent that that was not going to happen. Nobody wanted to invest in Eastern Europe, didn't care much about trade with Eastern Europe. And so they could not count on increasing economic relations with the West to keep their economies going. But they had no alternative but to keep hoping. It was sort of a wan hope, but they did keep hoping. But there was also not much energy on our side. Now, Yugoslavia had its own structures, and we dealt with it separately, even formally. The Bureau was Eastern Europe and Yugoslavia. But it too was on a downhill curve following Tito's death in 1980. In the early 1970s, Tito had purged both a liberal Serbian leadership and a more nationalistic Croatian leadership, the two largest Yugoslav republics. And after that, the country sank slowly into kind of a self-centered federalism. Somebody said to me, looking at it, that it's a federation of little economic units gathered around at sort of county level, which were run by the party chief, the League of Communists head in the given county, the government representative, and the banker. And it was a recipe really for sort of parish pump nationalism. So that was on the rise there too. Now, for our part, we continue to support Yugoslavia's independence and territorial integrity as we had since 1948. But we really didn't have much interest or concern with Yugoslav domestic developments. Now, US-Soviet relations then moved forward on the kind of bumpy path that's described in my article. A breakthrough over the release of Pentecostalists from the American embassy in 1983. Then the freeze after the shutdown of the Korean airliner, the shoot down of the Korean airliner in August, which got us into, and then the deployment of US INF in Western Europe that fall, the hot autumn as it was called. That got us into the US presidential election year. Brezhnev had died in November of '82. His successor, Yuri Andropov, died in February of '83. You had another old guy, Chernenko, was there, and so also old. I was there for one of the funerals, and I asked a CIA expert to look out on top of the mausoleum and give me the average age of the five top guys. And he toted it up in his head. He said they're 300 years old, 75 years old apiece. So it was really an aging relationship. And a lot of the Soviet politics, our election was a presidential year. They sank into succession politicking. So they were much less able to go in any direction in that year. Gorbachev came on in, Reagan's landslide in November of '84 over Mondale. Yeah. Right after that, came back together to get relations going again. And Gorbachev came on in March of '85. That quickened the pace. And up to the first summit in Geneva in November of that year, between Reagan and Gorbachev. And that ended, that cycle ended with the meeting in Reykjavik in October of 1987. It was a very bumpy road, which You'll see if you read the article. But with relations ticking over after Reykjavik, I mean, they're sort of moving forward on all fronts. Even though the meeting was a failure, but in terms of, since nobody wanted to admit it and take the blame for it, they kept on working across the board, and that was going sort of a little bit of everywhere. And so I was able at that point to give more attention to Eastern Europe. And by serendipity, we now in the US government discovered a champion for Eastern Europe. He's a man named John Whitehead. He was a self-made man. He worked himself through college guessing weights on the Jersey Shore, but had spent most of his life as his professional life as the head of Goldman Sachs, the giant investment firm. And he had come into as Schultz's deputy, the #2 in the State Department, for the second term. He spent the first year working on Latin American debt successfully, but in late '86, he asked Schultz for a kind of a mandate to pay special attention to Eastern Europe. He'd been interested in Eastern Europe ever since the Hungarian Revolution of 1956. And Schultz gave him that mandate. My colleagues on the East European desk were appalled because he was a man who had no recent experience with Eastern Europe. And I told him, he's going to be our guy. He's going to be our champion. And so I attached myself to him, you know, well, not like a leech, but like, pretty firmly, and accompanied him on a series of trips. He loved to travel around Eastern Europe that really led him to define our policies there under late communism. Communist rule in Eastern Europe was running out of steam, and you could feel it. I mean, country after country were reaching the limits of the kind of economic growth that was possible under Stalinism. It was still paying off, some in Bulgaria and Romania, but in the northern countries, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, it was no longer producing. And all of them were in the grip of what I call the Iron Ring, which is a name from Austro-Hungarian history, because structurally, the more they industrialized, the more they came to depend on the Soviet Union for raw materials to produce the industrial goods they wanted to, and markets for those goods, because they were pretty second-rate machinery. And only the Soviets were willing to take it and pay in oil and gas and coal to make it happen. The GDR, there were outlets from this iron ring. GDR had a special relationship with the Federal Republic. Romania had some oil that it could sell on Western markets, although it was running out. It ran out in the course of the 80s. Bulgaria had a Western market for its fruits and vegetables, and it also carved out a position for itself as sort of the lead country for new IT technology. And we're training cadres to make that new branch sort of run. It was only good in the bloc, but that was an important boost for Bulgarian economics. But the alternatives to dependence on the Soviets were shrinking all over the area. And the Soviets themselves were so confident that this iron ring would continue to work that in the course of the decade, the 80s, they started boosting their export prices for oil and gas and coal up toward world levels. And even though the East Europeans raised some of their prices, compensated somewhat, it was still a new tremendous squeeze on East European economies. So they were all happy to receive Whitehead and his little team. as we traveled around. But Poland was the most eager of all. And as usual, Poland was the bellwether for change that was in the offing. It had lifted martial law formally in 1983. I mean, it maintained repression under other legal provisions, but the first of the NATO criteria had been satisfied in 1983. And in September 1986, just as I came on board, it released the last of its political prisoners, which was the second NATO criterion for reversing sanctions. And that triggered a fight within the US administration over whether to lift our sanctions in response. Opposition came from Treasury, which said, you know, the country's a deadbeat. I mean, any help we give them is going to be wasted. And from a whole range of people in the State Department and elsewhere, AFL-CIO, for instance, which had been a great supporter of solidarity from the beginning and was still doing a lot of funneling with the help that we were giving solidarity clandestinely. They were against lifting sanctions, but Whitehead was for it because he thought it would help us maintain our leverage and our activity out there. And with him in charge, President Reagan lifted sanctions on Poland in February of 1987. Then in the fall, Vice President Bush suddenly announced that he was going to visit Poland. He was obviously angling for the Polish-American vote in 1988 when he intended to run. But the trip provoked another tangle within the US government. And it was over what Bush would say to Jaruzelski about what we would offer Poland if Poland continued on the path of political liberalization. And the same contestants lined up within the government, Treasury at the head of saying, you know, we're deadbeats, shouldn't promise them stuff they can't use. And US ties, economic ties still mattered to Poland. I mean, they still had that terrible debt. Solidarity and Underground had managed to prevent, by pushing for abstentions, the regime was trying to legislate economic reform with no political reform. And Solidarity had prevented that from happening. So the regime was sort of stuck. And I remember sitting next to Bush in the White House session where he overruled his friend of 30 years, Treasury Secretary Jim Baker, on the question of whether he would tell Jaruzelski that if political reform continued, there would be economic benefits for Poland. And that's what he told him. He also said publicly that we would help. If political reform continued, we would help with Poland's towering foreign debt. And he also advocated publicly, radio address, for national reconciliation, which was everyone understood meant dialogue with Solidarity and the church, which was NATO's third criterion. Now, Whitehead's other trips around the area, they were all fun. Maybe not for the East Europeans, but people who were with Whitehead. He really could, he could really sail pretty close to the policy wind. I remember he told his first meeting with the Hungarians, he said, why don't you leave the Warsaw Pact? And his special assistant had to take him into one of those transparent boxes we had in our embassies to avoid being overheard, and just read the riot act to him. You know, John, you cannot say that.
They tried it at 56.
But he also didn't bear a grudge. I mean, that special assistant went on to become the #3 man in the State Department, Mark Grossman, later on. But he offered the possibility of economic benefits while he kept making clear where the US stood on issues. everywhere he promoted human rights. And we met with dissidents wherever we could. We even found some dissidents in Bulgaria. Well, but before we could meet with them, we put them on a train to Vienna. We had appointments with them, but they were all already on their way out of the country by the time we were supposed to meet. I mean, Bulgaria was in some ways fun to deal with. They were also a chance for me, as alongside, to observe how these countries were dealing with Gorbachev. Because by 1987, Gorbachev, frustrated by obstruction of nomenclatura for his reform program, had adopted glasnost as a way of mobilizing people from the bottom against the entrenched bureaucrats. But that was a real problem for the East European leaders because they were used to following the Soviet example and glorying in it. But now the Soviet example was liberalization. So they had a problem with what to do with it. There was no formal rescission of the Brezhnev doctrine, the post-1968 doctrine, that the Soviet Union had an obligation to defend socialism in Eastern Europe, but it was becoming less and less convincing as the months went by. In fact, in Poland in 1986, a liberal communist, Mieczysław Rakowski, wrote a secret memo to Jaruzelski, which argued that the Soviets could no longer be counted on to preserve party rule in Poland, so that the party was going to have to reform itself to make itself competitive in an open political system. So the writing was on the wall for more and more people. So as we traveled around, Poland and Hungary were following the example of Gorbachev, so they were kind of attractive. They had reformed communists. They were trying to allow a certain amount of political discourse. When we traveled to Czechoslovakia, however, Vasil Bilak, who was the leader one of the ones who had invited the Soviets in 1968, he blandly claimed that they'd already done everything Gorbachev was doing, so they didn't have to do any more. And in Bulgaria, Todor Zhivkov, the old fox, he told Whitehead that he recently called a plenary meeting of the Central Committee and encouraged everybody to come up with new ideas, but forbidden them to praise him. And he said, of course, they disobeyed me. So, and he'd actually gone to Moscow and told the Soviets that
new ideas of the trades.
Right.
he'd gone to Moscow and told the Soviets that he was going to pull the party out of the government, which was an old Khrushchev idea that got Khrushchev in trouble too. And the Soviets calmed him down. And he came back to Sofia and said, I tried, but they wouldn't let me reform. Anyway. Meanwhile, he launched a bizarre campaign to make Bulgarian Turks, who are about 1/10 of the population in 2 communities, change their names to Bulgarian names and use just the Bulgarian language. And this culminated 3 years later in 1989 in really a mass expulsion of Turks to Turkey. Many of them, I think, subsequently came back after the fall of communism, but it was strange. I think no one understood it. I'm not sure people understand it today. It was the kind of thing that was going on as regimes left control. And it's a Bulgarian form of nationalism. I mean, the Turks have always been a problem for Bulgarian identity. Now, in Romania, at the end of the string, after years of our complaints about increasing repression. In a meeting with Whitehead, Ceausescu's foreign minister announced that Ceausescu was withdrawing from our treaty on agreement on most favored nation trade treatment for Romania. I asked for the floor and pointed out that our agreement didn't provide for abolition, only suspension. So they fell back and we suspended the agreement, but kept the structure, which was one of the things I liked doing. But by the end of the decade, we and the Soviets had about the same order of preferences in Eastern Europe. Both of us favored the Polish and Hungarian regimes, reform communist regimes. Czechoslovakia and Bulgaria were somewhere in between. And Romania was off the charts. Ceausescu in the early 80s had started to pay off all of Romania's foreign debt in order to avoid dependence on anybody, including us, and really had beggared the country. When we visited Bucharest, I remember they gave us a lunch in the old Athene Falas Hotel. We sat in a corridor with our overcoats on and our breath showing because there was no heat. Outside, they'd taken down every 2 out of every 3 streetlights. So it was like Paris under the German occupation. And we heard that ambulances were no longer picking up people over 70. So Ceausescu was asserting his independence, but he made a pariah out of his country. Yugoslavia also, meanwhile, trudged downhill, with nationalism rising all over the country. I had to go to Belgrade once to calm a revolt of our embassy staff against our ambassador, who the staff considered too soft on extremism, and especially on Serb nationalism. He took me around to some of these mass meetings that Milosevic was calling among Serbs around the country, and there was some worrisome martyr talk, old Serbian Orthodox martyrdom talk. But mainly, going to those meetings, they looked like picnics. I mean, they looked like families bringing their kids and picnics and feeling happy about themselves. And since I lived through the Fourth Republic in France and always thought de Gaulle cauterized a bad wound, I always thought that a little bit of nationalism was a good thing. So none of us. I did, in 1989, I ended up revising our country goals for Yugoslavia to include support for human rights and respect for the rule of law, in addition to support for territorial integrity and independence. But the truth is that nobody at any could imagine the kind of tragedy that was in the offing in that country. And now 1988 was a year of accelerating movement. In the middle of the year, Poland was racked with wildcat strikes that were not called by solidarity, not controlled by solidarity, and they scared everybody. They scared solidarity because it's younger workers especially were running out from under control. It scared the regime because of they were afraid of what their hardliners would do and whatever supporters they could find in Moscow. By autumn, they had agreed to initiate roundtable talks. Solidarity is still illegal, but the roundtable talks would convene to discuss the whole range of issues to begin in February of 1989. The overall setting was favorable. December 1987, Gorbachev visited Washington and signed the INF Treaty, which abolished a whole category of nuclear weapons for the first time. And attention now turned slowly toward the reason why those nuclear weapons had been deployed in Europe in the first place. And the reason was the tremendous overhang of Soviet conventional superiority. So attention turned more and more to that overhang, why the Soviets had so many more troops in Europe than we did. The negotiations on conventional forces, MBFR, were kind of grinding away, but without much hope of any kind of progress. Bush was elected in November in place of Reagan. And in December, Gorbachev came to New York for the UN General Assembly. He was on his way for a trip around the US. I mean, we planned a really extensive trip because Reagan, who personalized things, thought, you know, if he could only see for himself what a great country we were, it would do some good. But at the UN, he sprang another surprise by announcing a unilateral withdrawal, not negotiated, but a unilateral withdrawal of 500,000 Soviet troops from Eastern Europe. I mean, I was in the audience, my hair stood up. We hadn't anticipated it. It was just amazing. He had to curtail his trip around the US because of the earthquake and earthquake in Armenia. He had to go back and handle it. But he explained, I was there when he explained to Reagan and Bush, the old president and the new president, that there were some low-grade politicians in the Soviet Union who were using nationalism to put pressure on Moscow. And I thought to myself, Mikhail Sergeyevich, you have no idea what you're up against. And he really didn't. I mean, he didn't understand nationalism of others. He was probably not nationalistic enough himself. Anyway, when the Polish Roundtable met in February, it was certain to end Solidarity's delegalization, and with Solidarity's legalization and participation, inclusion in Polish governance in some way. So those were the third of NATO's conditions for rescinding sanctions. And this triggered a final policy confrontation within the US government over what our response to a power sharing agreement coming out of the roundtable should be. The incoming Bush administration had mandated 2 policy reviews, one for the Soviet Union and one for Eastern Europe, partly to gain time. I mean, they wanted time, and the delays that those caused, I think, probably hurt Gorbachev severely in his struggles in the Soviet Union. But because in the end, he and Bush didn't meet until the end of the year at Malta, and he'd lost a lot of ground by then. But within the administration, there was not a whole lot of controversy, except once again on Poland, how we should respond to a roundtable success. Contestants were the familiar Treasury, traditional anti-communists, and the context was still what it had been since 1956, that probably the East European communist regimes were there to stay. I mean, there was not much sense of radical change in the offing. But after another battle, the result ended up being the same. We in state appealed to the new Bush team in the White House, Robert Blackwell and Condoleezza Rice, for authorization to tell the group that the president wanted a response which promised economic benefit to the economic benefit as a response to this major political liberalization. They authorized us to do it. Bush used our draft, which had been snuck to him by a subordinate of mine. I didn't even know he'd snuck it over to the White House. I didn't learn about it until 2019. And I said, why'd you do that? And he said, well, why didn't you tell me? He said, well, I knew you'd approve of it, but I just didn't want to make it harder for you. Anyway, that's the way some things get done in government. And Bush, in a speech at Hamtramck, the Polish-American enclave in Detroit, announced economic benefits. What he announced was peanuts, but the principle was gain. And that summer, the elections that agreed at the round table really wiped out the communists, elections of June 4th. And a solidarity-led government emerged that summer. In November 9th, the Berlin Wall fell. The next day, Zhivkov was gone in Bulgaria. By the end of the month, the Czechoslovak Communist Party, with typical discipline, had voted itself out of power unanimously. And Ceausescu was executed in Bucharest on December 25th. By the year's end, our economic assistance to Poland had risen from peanuts to $2 billion. And really, we were looking at a new world. The East Europeans liberated themselves. Gorbachev was a critical element to making it happen. And we had helped. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Yeah, I have numerous questions, but I will wait until Nadia Boyadjieva is going to come.
Thank you very much, Tom, for your deep analysis and broad and picture that you offered of the events from 1980s and discovering maybe not known aspects or relatively not known aspects of the American foreign policy in Eastern and East Central Europe at that time. First of all, I would like to thank Cold War Studies seminar for inviting me to be a commentator for this brilliant talk for me. This is an honor, but also this is a big task to speak after Dr. Stevens. But nevertheless,
I tried to leave you no space.
Comments about
yeah, it is difficult, but nevertheless, because I have a task, I'm going to try to do it. So I wrote a few kind of notes, few comments that I'm going to touch up. First of all, I would like to say that the panorama that you presented for such a short time was just excellent, and I think that you touched upon all the important, according to my knowledge as historian and lawyer, important topics, issues, processes that were most important for the American foreign policy at that time, including even disclosing some like internal even jokes on some issues, which was very useful for people who didn't get the chance to attend this, to live. Actually, I did live for myself. I did live at that period. But for me, as I was listening to you, I think that this talk was very important, not only from academic point of view, to learn what was, about the U.S. policy from a U.S. diplomat, but also it was very interesting for me, and as a person who grew up at that time I was in a high school and in mid-80s, and I was in a university student in late 80s, And for me, it was a very interesting time, a university student, being a student at Sophia University, studying history and specializing in modern and contemporary world history. So exactly the topics, yes, what was going on. But let me go back to the professional field.
Sure.
And raise a few points. So my first point is related to the importance that you touched pertaining to the U.S. policy towards Eastern Central Europe. So you mentioned that Soviet Union was the main priority during the Reagan administration and Bush administration when you compared the two administrations, and it has always been in comparison to the rest of the area. So also one thing I would like to clear for the audience maybe and for myself, East Central Europe, what does it mean? What countries do you regard as East Central Europe? Because nowadays, 30 years after the end of the Cold War, there are new terms that came out, like Western Balkans, like the Southeastern Europe, and just Balkans. And at that time, what was for you? What was what U.S. Policy administration regarded as Eastern Europe? Just Soviet Union and Central European countries that belong to the Warsaw Pact, including Balkan countries belonging to the Warsaw Pact. This is from what I got, and Yugoslavia as a special case.
Right.
Is this correct?
It was really the Soviet Union, Eastern Europe, undifferentiated and formal, and Yugoslavia. It was just the three. Now, we recognize the sort of the layers. I mean, the northern tier, the Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary, and then Romania, Bulgaria. We tended to lump, and then Yugoslavia. So, and GDR was always we considered it within East-West relations, but it was German policy. I mean, they separate within the State Department. You had a Office of German Affairs, which was FRG, GDR, Austria, and Switzerland. So, I mean, Switzerland kind of had to find a home, and that's where
it's like linguistic more. That was attached to the language.
Yeah, it was sort of based on language, except of course there are 3 languages in Switzerland.
To be honest though, Tom, just on this point that Nadia has raised is it doesn't make that much sense to me to include, say, Yugoslavia, but exclude East Germany. It would have made much more sense to have Warsaw Pact countries. Particularly because Albania was excluded. So, again, I don't know who decides these configurations within the State Department and other agencies of the U.S. government, but there could have been, say, Southeastern Europe excluded with Bulgaria and Romania treated separately, and then have a war. So
I think that's happened subsequently.
Yeah.
I mean, now you do have Southeastern.
And perhaps I can clarify that. Since I actually was the head of the GDR Berlin unit. The reason East Germany was included in the German thing was because there was no peace treaty. And we did not recognize, for example, East Berlin as the capital of East Germany. 4 power rights included East Germany, unlike the Warsaw Pact. We had military missions which sent patrols and all kinds of things into East Germany, sometimes with quite tragic consequences. But that was the reason for keeping all that together with West Germany, because officially World War II was not over, and World War II did not end until the signing of the 2+4 agreement of German occupation. That is what ended World War II officially.
Thank you very much. I think, yeah, so we can continue with this. Thank you both. Yeah, that you made a very interesting comparison of the Ronald Reagan policy and George Bush in speaking of different cases of different countries. Also, you clearly made a focus on the profound importance of Mikhail Gorbachev and the changes that he's coming into power and his ideas of perestroika in new European house, or common European house, etc., brought to the whole Eastern Central Europe. I'm just curious here how U.S. administration regarded coming into power Mikhail Gorbachev. Was it surprise for U.S. policy? Is there any CIA, for example, documents pertaining? I'm just trying to, to make the conversation.
I think
it was known that he would come to the power, and some expectations for something new that he might bring in terms of changing Soviet foreign policy force to the Western Europe and to the United States, because of course his coming into power was very important for the European Union, both for internal politics, in European Soviet Union for its internal politics, but also it had great influence. And you pointed out in your talk, in different countries, the influence was different, but it had a great influence on domestic policies and the orientation on the Soviet bloc countries. But how American administration at that time looked at Gorbachev, looked at many expectations for that some new guy is coming on power. He's so different from everything that U.S. government has seen until now.
Yeah, it was widely expected when he came to power. I mean, for the last year, I think it was expected that he would come to power. In other words, I think there was a feeling that a deal had been made after Andropov's death, that Chernenko would take over for a while, and then you would see. Actually, his choices as general secretary was contested. I mean, in March of 1985, you had the opposition of Grecian. I think the Moscow party boss was the opposition candidate, and he came to power by going secretly to Andrei Gromyko, the foreign minister, who threw his weight behind Gorbachev. You know, he has a nice smile, but he has steel teeth. Gromyko is supposed to have said. So we sort of expected him, but it was contested even then. And I think we were very modest in our expectations. I mean, when Bush and Schultz met with him after Chernenko's funeral, and they had a conversation, and Gorbachev said, you know, we both have to think differently about things. And they reported to Reagan that we're dealing with a different kind of person. But in terms of what to expect, the administration was very careful. I mean, it didn't want to be hoodwinked by a fast-talking new guy. And it took a long time for most people to be convinced that he was a genuine reformer. And don't forget, the first year it was mainly anti-alcoholism and anti-corruption. I mean, it was not, you weren't doing structural reforms until you got to 1986. And there he came out with that tremendous arms control platform, you know, the kind of thing that Soviet leaders are expected to do. I called it an election platform after the election, you know, where he proposed elimination of nuclear weapons by 2000. I mean, these big, bold ideas, but it's very easy to dismiss that as propaganda, as words, but need to be followed up by deeds in negotiation. So people were very careful in their expectations of Gorbachev. And I think until very late, I think most people said, look, the structures have not changed. I think probably it was the elections of March 1989 to the new council, what's it called?
The Congress of 1988 with the.
No, nine, the March 8th.
Oh, the Congress of People.
Congress of People. Yeah, the people were convinced that this is real, and structural. Things are going on that need to be supported. But in the end, we never gave him the kind of support that he was looking for. And we observed what the effect I've described, how we observed the effect he was having in Eastern Europe. But I think while we encouraged change in Eastern Europe, I think we always felt that the Soviets were going to prevent it from getting out of hand, as in 1956. So we could afford to push because they would keep processes of change on track. I mean, that was an unspoken assumption I think within the U.S. government.
Thank you very much for revealing this. There's nuances.
Well, and Bush,
policy
when the Bush administration came in, it also had a feeling that Reagan had gotten too chummy with Gorbachev. Was being too sunny in his approach to the Soviets. And that's one of the things that accounted for those reviews that I chaired. To put things off until, in terms of making real decisions, until they could get their ducks in a row. So Bush was more cautious. I mean, at the Governor's Island, I was there, and Gorbachev spent his whole time getting Bush to say that he was going to continue Reagan's policies, and he wouldn't say it. He would just.
Okay, very good.
Actually, a lot of documents now are available for researchers are coming from the Bush libraries and archival collections, and also from Reagan. I had chance several times before the pandemic, even actually after the pandemic, to visit those archival. And those archives and to get a chance even to see some documents. I was interested, of course, about American policy towards the Eastern Europe and Bulgaria, Yugoslavia, etc. I found documents, but it will take a lot of time for those documents to be arranged in a way, because you're just having boxes and full of documents, and you're grabbing them, like you can see that nobody couldn't process them yet. So many documents about the administration policy towards not only that region, of course, but this is another matter. So I have one more point here. How do you regard U.S. soft power versus official policy? You also mentioned that in the beginning of your talk about NATO perception, having in mind that the United States is the leading power of NATO. How that did the changes and changes in Eastern Europe affected in some way the decisions taken in NATO, in the NATO headquarters, how to continue, how to pursue. And because I'm mentioning here the soft power, so what was the place of the soft power versus official policy, and if with official policy, not only diplomatic policy, but also military strength?
I don't know, I think.
Or you're just leaving NATO apart and
Yeah, I don't know the evolution of NATO. I mean, I'm sure they were, you know, mainly what they watch is military. I mean, they also have a lot of political analysis. But yeah, NATO is also a very inertial organization. I mean, it doesn't.
You mentioned about some declaration that was.
Well, the special declaration on Poland was that was an important document. Yeah, and mainly that was sort of kept. The Germans would break ranks occasionally. I mean, they gave $1 billion to Hungary because the Federal Republic was in the business of buying East European Germans out of Eastern Europe, both with Romania and Hungary. So the Germans were looser on dealing with Eastern Europe than NATO policy actually called for, but it was okay. It was okay. And I think, Andrew, correct me if I'm wrong, I think a lot of German policy had to do with Eastern.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, that's the focus of German policy.
Well,
East Germany rather than the other.
One of the things that happened is, unlike 61, when everybody was coming out from the West, once the Hungarians started allowing people to go into Austria, you had this tremendous, almost geometrically increasing flow of East Germans into Hungary to get into Austria. And that ultimately provoked the crisis of the East German government.
Yeah.
Because they couldn't stop it. And the West Germans said people, first they were standoffish, and then they said, no, we're gonna do exactly what you said. We're gonna pay for all these people to come out. And sort of that was the turning point. And up until then, they were careful in NATO because they didn't want to do anything. And even in the 2+4 negotiations, they did not want to antagonize the Soviets because their policy was rapprochement, and we get everybody closer. Ostpolitik is the main example, and that's how we overcome the divide. And as part of the agreement and unification, they agreed there'll be no NATO, foreign NATO troops on East German territory. East German territory has a NATO guarantee, but no troops to defend it.
Soft power in general, I mean, was a great background factor because it was not just American soft power, but Western Europe as an example of where East Europeans wanted to go. The market economy, democracy, open political systems, freedom of assembly. Those were things that were there as attractions, and sort of the contrast with the difficulties of East European life, and I think the beauties of Western life were exaggerated, probably, but that soft power counted. I mean, ours did too. And the concrete form it took, though, was the encouragement of exchanges, person-to-person exchanges, which were part of Helsinki, and I think, and were part of every Western government's bilateral relations with East European countries. Part of that was to encourage exchanges, which would give East Europeans the personal experience with what the West was really like. But yeah.
Program was established at that time. It's one more, and one more point here. I initially started with the relative importance of external factors. So Soviet Union, European Economic Community, United States, China. What about China, and especially what was how to assess the impact of June 1999 massacre in China to the US policy, and did it have any effect to the policy in the area that we're talking about?
That the same might happen. So
see, I was no longer there, so I can't give a personal answer. I had gone on to another assignment. I mean, it was noticed that the Tiananmen crackdown and killing took place the same day as the Polish election. that destroyed any communist chance of competing for primacy in Poland, but I doubt if it had any operational effect on US policy toward Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. I mean, we had, no, I doubt it, but again, I can't say for sure.
Yeah, well, I think I should stop
Okay,
here.
yeah, thanks very much, Nadia. And I'll come to George in 1 second, George Pearl, who has also had a great deal of experience in dealing with Eastern Europe. But just very quickly, Tom, let me give you a couple of questions that you can think about, and then I'll come to George as well, and I'll take other questions as well. One of them is in your article about policy, US policy toward the Soviet Union. George Shultz played a large role, whereas in this story, he's invisible. What was his, did he just give Whitehead complete latitude, or at what point did Shultz get involved? And similarly, his successor, James Baker, who at the time, you discussed Baker's role when he was Secretary of Treasury in the late Reagan years, but then you don't really cover what his role was in the Bush years, when he played a crucial role along with Bush himself. And that also leads me to a second question, which you dealt with Yugoslavia in the early to mid 80s, but you didn't really, partly because you weren't there anymore, Washington, in the early 90s. And that reported comment that Baker made about we don't have a dog in this fight in Yugoslavia. By the way, I've never been able to track down
Oh, is that right?
where he said it. It's been reported over and over,
Yeah.
but I don't think he actually said it. He said many things like it,
Yeah.
but I don't think that comment, I think it was mostly made up afterward based on what US policy was. So if you could comment on at that point, how the United States handled the dissolution of Yugoslavia, and that was the early period there when it was beginning to break up. George, let me.
It's basically a follow-on to yours, Mark, and that is that Tom, as somebody who worked under you on the East European desk, we had this sense too, as you mentioned in your comments, that the heights of the U.S. government, Shultz, at least when I came into the State Department, it was Reagan, Shultz, and they dealt with the Soviet Union, and that was the number one. And we, dealing with Eastern Europe, we were the stepchildren. I mean, you had in your purview, as you said, your red was Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, but we were always kind of the afterthoughts. And I say that because obviously that is the big issue. And looking for those that could champion the cause of the the East Europeans as being different from the Soviet Union was always difficult within the US government, because we were like, Whitehead was given this writ. And I remember when you came down there and we all like, oh my God. And then when he was on his trips, and he had this, you may even remember, this special feeling for Bulgaria, that he thought they really charmed him, and he came back from the trip and you gave us that. We're like, our eyes are bugging. But nevertheless, you could see that it was like given as an afterthought, and the big boys were dealing with the big fish there. And Eastern Europe was a peripheral concern. Even Poland to a certain extent, although that became Bush as vice president got involved in that, and that was like a big coup because nobody would pay that much attention to it. Then fast forwarding, I could see the theme having been in the Soviet Union when it was collapsing, and the like, and it had collapsed. The view was we're dealing with the Russian Federation, and all those other republics were not really, there was nobody really in charge of them and the like it was with Eastern Europe. And I don't know if you had thoughts, since you were present at both of these occurrences, about, in the fear I remember among the East Europeans, as it was with the other republics of the Soviet Union, was there was going to be some deal between the US and Russia, or the US and the Soviet Union over our heads. It was Yalta
Yalta.
in both cases. And were you, what is your comment about that sort of view of how America, the United States has dealt with these? That is Eastern Europe as peripheral main US interests, and also the republics that came out of the Soviet Union support. And I just will say one thing because of our Georgian here. I think Shevardnadze being made foreign minister in place of Gromyko had, I think, a big effect certainly on Schultz and others, would you say? Because he was not a die-in-the-wool Soviet diplomat.
Yeah.
That kind of, anyways.
It sounded strange because nowadays it would be very strange having somewhere foreign minister who doesn't speak any foreign language.
Right.
And Gromyko, Tavarish Niet, but he was English speaker, right?
And the Soviet foreign minister was, oh my God.
An ambassador to Washington.
Anyway,
Shevardnadze was the one who kept on saying, we want to be a civilized country.
right.
It's a big thing to say.
Anyways, that was my comment, but there are others.
George, yeah, it's accurate. I mean, and
Yeah.
you were there too. I mean, they weren't the runts of the litter, but they were not the center of policy gravity. And I think the same thing, I should tell people that George, as the Soviet Union was weakening, George was a circuit rider out of our consulate general in Leningrad, as it still was, around the Baltics. I mean, he kept sweeping through the Baltics and reporting on them and helping explain to them that we were not trying to break up the Soviet Union, but we did support their
Which interestingly, within the State Department, they were not within the North European division, which when you take how East Germany was put in with Germany. We always wondered, since we didn't recognize the Baltic republics as part of the Soviet Union, and they really had wanted, could we put them geographically with Finland? Anyways.
And I had those conversations with Baltic people in Washington too, So what he says is accurate. I think their fear, I mean, I was ambassador to Poland when the Soviet Union was coming apart. The Poles, they had a mixed feelings about the Soviet threat. Which they'd grown up with as, resenting Soviet domination, and now that the Soviet Union had disappeared, had the Soviet threat disappeared. And I can remember during the putsch in August of 1991, we had a delegation coming it's a right led by a former governor of Nebraska, a woman. So it was a conservative delegation coming out of Moscow on the second day of the putsch. And they had a dinner for them in the Marriott Hotel in Warsaw. And they were almost kissing Polish soil. I mean, they were so relieved to leave the Soviet Union in turmoil because they were convinced that the putsch was going to win. And Poles were popping up all over the room saying, "We told you so, they're slaves. I mean, they only understand them now." And all the old Polish shibboleths about the Soviet Union. I stood up and said, "Look, there are 10,000 people in Moscow protecting the White House, and there are tanks out there. So it's not over." Well, when Poles said, 10,000 people in a country of 140 million, what is that? And I said, well, it may be enough to turn this putsch back. So why don't you wait another day? Well, the next day it was over. But so there was that fear is always there, and fear of Yalta. And I think we're setting ourselves up for another generation of Yalta in Ukraine right now, because we're going to be be blamed if they don't get their maximum scoring. So yeah, I mean, it always has been. With in response to Mark's question about Schultz really did turn it over to Whitehead and us. I mean, you know, because I gave the same support to Whitehead that I gave to Schultz on the Soviet side. But of course, there's a tremendous apparatus on every issue in Soviet relations, especially arms control. And, you know, defense had almost no say in relations with Eastern Europe. But whereas it was huge in arms control, because you're dealing with reductions in weapons on both sides. So Schultz really did not, I think he supported Whitehead, you know, on something like rescinding sanctions on Poland in the fall of 1986. He had to have Schultz's support to go to Reagan to get him to sign the rescission. But he really didn't get in on Baker. Again, I was gone, so I wasn't close to it. Baker, you know, did make a trip. I remember a trip to very
wildly.
yeah, I mean, crazy, sort of odd thing. But I think everybody wanted to stay out of Yugoslavia. I mean, you know, when I remember going to Paris when Warren Christopher was in Paris trying to get a Allied agreement to bomb but not put in. I don't know what they called it. It had a name, a policy of using air power but not troops with regard to Yugoslavia. And Reg Bartholomew in the courtyard of the Quai d'Orsay just sort of shaking his head because of such a feckless kind of policy. But that was already under Clinton. And you're asking about Baker, you know, which went up to well, January of '93.
Yeah, well, he had shifted over to the campaign.
Well, that's when Eagleberger ended up as the secretary.
Okay, and unfortunately, we're well past time, even bearing in mind the late start. So unfortunately, I'm gonna have to call the session to an end, but please feel free, if there isn't a class moving in, please feel free to ask Tom further questions. In his forthcoming memoir, he does discuss some of this, but I hope we'll also publish what he has produced today at the basic text of it. So with that, let me thank both Tom and Nadia and everyone for